Hello, dear friends. My name is Vasyl Pekhnio. I'm a Ukrainian journalist, and I invite all of you to watch this latest update on Ukrainian battle map situation as of August the 9th. So please join, watch this video, like it. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave your comments just below the video. I will start, actually, this is not only a summary of the previous day, but it is also summary of the whole week. So, of course, the main key point where Russians are pushing and pushing, this is Pokrovsk region. And I will start, of course, with overviewing actually this region of battlefield. Let's begin.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
So the city of Pokrovsk and its surroundings and the overall situation around the Pokrovsk direction, around Pokrovsk, by the way, which is the center of the Khortytsia operational strategic grouping of troops. But since yesterday, the Khortytsia operational strategic grouping of troops is no longer called Khortytsia, it is now called Dnipro. Why was this name changed and for what purpose? Well, here we can only speculate and guess. Everyone can decide for themselves what it means. Is this a sign that, in short, I won't try to manipulate or make assumptions here. The name of the operational strategic command has simply changed. Instead of Khortytsia, the main command in the eastern direction is now Dnipro. So what is happening right now? The enemy has 2 points of movement, 2 points of pressure, so to speak, the north and the south. The south is here, the north is here. Accordingly, in the south, the main battles the Russians are currently engaged in are for the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk, specifically for the settlements of Pershetravnya and the settlement of Troyanda. Fighting is taking place for both of these here. The Russian occupiers are pressing from the southern flank to break through closer to Pokrovsk. There was such information circulating, in particular from intercepted radio communications regarding the occupiers obtained by our soldiers, that supposedly, concerning Pokrovsk and its southern outskirts, there is an objective to seize or enter them and begin urban fighting from the south of this city by the 1st of September. That's the information we have. Is it possible to carry this out? Well, after all, there are still 3 weeks left. So my scenario that the Russians could start fighting from the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk by that time is quite realistic. At the moment, there are no occupiers inside the city of Pokrovsk. The city is under control, the enemy is being destroyed, and there is a response to any of their attempts to penetrate. However, it is worth noting that the Russians are actively searching for weak spots and are not at all afraid to take risks in order to break into the center of Pokrovsk, even though their main priority is to block the city from the flanks rather than entering it directly. Yesterday, the soldiers of the 155th Mechanized Brigade, who are defending Pokrovsk, published this video, raising the Ukrainian blue and yellow flag so that everyone could see and know we are there, we are holding the defense. And all of this is happening under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine, the defense forces of our state. Further north, in the area of Rodinske, that's where the fiercest and most difficult battles are taking place today across the entire Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad agglomeration. I have already gone over this situation in detail more than once, but as of today, to the east of Rodinske, in this area, the Russians are trying to gain a foothold near the mines in order to advance further and capture Rodinske, which in turn would open the gates for battles from another flank in both Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad. So far, the occupiers have not managed to secure a foothold on the territory of the mine. However, on this threatening and probably already insurmountable salient that has formed here, right here, this is our biggest problem. I have said many times, dozens of times, that this is our problem. While Russian propaganda was drawing attention to the fact that we were having problems near Sumy, problems near Zaporizhzhia, they were trying to convince us that there would be a major Russian offensive there and kept coming up with more and more things. I have emphasized dozens of times that this is exactly where our main problem lies, which began to take shape before, well, around the beginning of summer, or even a little earlier. And now we are reaping its most difficult consequences. This is the encirclement of Pokrovsk from the north. This is the advance in the direction of the Kostiantynivka front, particularly in these two areas, Popiv Yar and Rusin Yar, and the settlement of Poltavka. Poltavka and Popiv Yar are effectively occupied by the enemy. In Rusin Yar, our forces are holding on, fighting continues and infantry assaults are ongoing. The enemy continues its active offensive there, trying to fully capture this village. Infantry attacks are also taking place toward Novye Shakhovye. Here you can see quite a wide gray zone. This is essentially not the Kostiantynivka or Pokrovsk direction anymore, but the Dobropilye direction. No other way to put it. Further south, on the borders of the Dnipropetrovsk region, in the Novopavlivka direction, the Russians, well, first of all, let's note this expansion on the deep state map in the area of Dachne. Many different Telegram communities have presented this as a major disaster and calamity, suggesting that the enemy is already in the Dnipropetrovsk region. This situation was somewhat clarified yesterday by deep state analysts. After all, it should be noted, as I have repeatedly said in my reviews, that we currently have 3 hotspots of tension along the borders of the Donetsk region. 2 of them are with the Dnipropetrovsk region, and 1 is in Zaporizhzhia. This is Dachne. Right here, in fact, is the area around the settlement of Maliivka. Let's see where she is. Here, Maliivka. This is also Dnipropetrovsk region. But for some reason, no one cares. For some reason, no one is shouting about this. Well, that is, I am again leading to the fact that the Russians are setting the information tone for us. Maliivka, and this is Tymyrivka, this is Zaporizhzhia region. For some reason, no one is shouting that the Russians are entering the territory of Zaporizhzhia. And this, by the way, Tymyrivka, creates a kind of, well, operational threat for us here, in the sense that breaching the lines in this direction already puts pressure on the rear of the Huliaipol front here, along the Zaporizhzhia axis. Accordingly, for some reason, no one is shouting about this here, but then we'll end up spinning the information in a way that's convenient for the Russians. Okay? So let's counteract this. For the record, I'm not denying that the Russians are present in the Dnipropetrovsk region. I'm not denying that they're exerting pressure here in the Dnipropetrovsk region. However, it's important to understand that Dachne, as deep state itself claims, is rather nothing more than, let's say, a clarification zone, an area where the enemy is constantly applying pressure in the eastern part of this settlement from the direction of Novukrainka. But at the same time, Dachne is definitely not under enemy occupation because the Russians currently can't establish a foothold there, and lately they can't even approach the village properly. However, it's obvious that the Russians are present in the village itself. They are operating with surgical precision. But all these efforts also have their limits. If a critical mass of Russian presence gathers, then, well, we see similar changes like this on the maps. But overall, I wouldn't rule out that in the Dnipropetrovsk region, or rather along this Novopavlivka direction, we will eventually see nothing other than a scenario of frontline realignment. And it would be completely logical for this realignment to follow the Vovcha River all the way here, up to Novopavlivka. That is, it is quite likely that the Russians will be able to occupy this entire strip, advancing along these lines, pushing through Kotlyarivka and Orikov, which they have not been able to break through for a very long time. But theoretically, they could do this from the direction of Dachne. But these attempts and any advances are proving to be very, very difficult for the Russians. And even if they reach Novopavlivka, it will not be a catastrophe. It will be nothing more than a leveling of the front line. That's why I wouldn't use all this Russian perspective on the situation. Panic, horror, disaster, catastrophe. The Russians have entered Dnipropetrovsk region. It's absolutely irrelevant to have such conversations. Well, if you want, throw rotten tomatoes at me, but I have always stood by this opinion. Where there are dangers, I say so. Where there are none, I say that as well. The danger is rather near Tymyrivka in the Zaporizhzhia direction, as I mentioned. The danger is now obvious in the Lyman direction. And this is one of the outcomes of this week because the Russians have advanced, as you can see, within the Serebryanske forestry area. In fact, they have advanced in many locations, and in Torsk they have created a gray zone in the center of the settlement, although in reality, I think it will soon turn red. And now from Torsk to the other side of the Zherebets River towards the settlement of Zarikne, here is Zarikne, the Russians are carrying out their attacks. The attacks on Zarikne are being conducted in particular with the use of motorcycles. I talked about this yesterday. Let's look at this video with the motorcycles now, and then I'll talk about the overall trend. It was published by the 63rd Mechanized Brigade, the Steel Lines Brigade, who claimed that this assault, this attack by motorcyclists was repelled. The vehicles themselves, along with the motorcyclists, were either destroyed or hit, and later the infantrymen themselves were found in the tree lines. A total of 25 units of such motorized equipment were used during this enemy attack from Torsk towards Zarikne. as reported by the 63rd Brigade, which, by the way, as I understand it, is a member of the 3rd or a component of the 3rd Army Corps, together with the 3rd Assault Brigade. It's not entirely clear. They are adjacent units there. So neighboring units were actually helping them to destroy all of this. The 40th and 45th Artillery Brigades, the K2 Unmanned Systems Regiment, by the way, that's Karylo Veres, as well as units of the National Guard and the Security Service of Ukraine. In total, 25 motorcycles were destroyed during the repulsion of this attack. But returning to the overall trend that is developing for us in the Lyman direction, it has been rapidly deteriorating lately. It has deteriorated, we can already state that, because Lyman has only a very small number of roads. One of them runs through Drobyshev and Shandry-Holov, like this, and then it continues on to Borova. From the south, the city is essentially pressed up against the Syrskyi Donets River. I don't know to what extent our crossings over the Syrskyi Donets are currently ready here, in case it becomes necessary to provide logistics for Lyman under critical conditions. Here, in blue, I've marked the strip of the Syrskyi Donets River. Why do I say that? I don't know if there are crossings here. Because in 2022, when the Russians were occupying Lyman, all the crossings around the city over the Syrskyi Donets were destroyed, both during the occupation and during the fighting for those areas. In short, all the crossings were destroyed at that time. That's why there are hardly any roads left, just a minimal number. And the Russians understand this, and right now they are putting pressure, in particular from the direction of Kolodyazy towards Stavki, from the direction of Zelena Dolina towards Drobyshev, and from Torske towards Zarychne. They will be moving in this direction now. And there is also pressure, undoubtedly, in the area of the Syrskyi forestry. But this is more of a threat, not so much to Lyman, as to a point further south on the Lyman, or rather the Siversk direction. This is a significant threat to the city of Siversk and to this entire Siversk pocket, a pocket that the Russians have long been trying to cut off. But now they are gaining potential new means to influence both Serebryanka and from there to affect Siversk. At the same time, they are putting pressure on the flanks from Verkhnyo-Kamyanske and from that same Hrihorivka. And in principle, all these pressures are taking place. The 81st Airmobile Brigade released a video showing how they repel even mechanized attacks in this direction. By the way, the Siversk direction is the one where the enemy is constantly using mechanized units in the form of barbecue tank vehicles and various other Frankensteins. Because, as the soldiers explained to me, the landscape here requires the use of vehicles. Here they use buggies, motorcycles, and all sorts of different vehicles to try to break through our front. But for more than 2 years now, the Russians have not been able to break through in the Siversk direction. But now the threat that is forming on the flank, particularly with the overhang from the Serebryanska forestry area, is actually a serious warning that is emerging for the Siversk direction on our, let's say, axis. Although, by the way, calling it the Siversk direction isn't entirely correct, because in essence, Sivershchina actually refers to the Kharkiv region. And now I want to talk further about the Kharkiv region, because at the beginning of this week, there was information circulating in the public space that the Russians tried to break through the border near the settlement of Hoptivka and the Hoptivka checkpoint. That's right here, to the north of Kharkiv, in the direction of Belgorod, right here. I mentioned that there are certain signs that the Russians, with their demonstrative actions and declared presence there, did make themselves known. They planted flags and tried to convince everyone that they were there. Basically, they are there, they were there, and they have been eliminated over a certain period of time. So not all attacks were completely repelled. And this video appeared just yesterday, showing how Russian positions and the Russians themselves are being finished off in those areas of Hoptivka, the Hoptivka checkpoint, where they had been spotted. So some of the infantry did manage to get in there and tried to establish a foothold, but they are being destroyed with the help of drones and artillery. This targeting is being carried out, in particular, by the forces of the 58th Mechanized Brigade. Summing up what has been happening on our front over the past week, I want to draw some conclusions about the Sumy region as well, since I am, so to speak, physically on the map, located in the north. I have wonderful friends, fighters, and colleagues there who are fighting and who report that, in fact, things are really tough for the Russians now in the Sumy region. They basically have only one point left where they maintain pressure. This is the area of Yunakivka and Sadki. These are two settlements right here. Here, the Russians are undoubtedly maintaining pressure. But the area on the left flank right here is completely under our advantage and control. In some places, we've already pushed the Russians all the way back to the border in this direction. And overall, as of now, as of August 9th, at the beginning of August, it can be stated that the Russian forces have, in fact, failed to create the declared, announced, and previously proclaimed so-called security buffer zone along the border in the Sumy region. The most they have managed to create are these small isolated pockets. And currently, there are no signs that the situation for Russia could significantly improve in the coming weeks. Meanwhile, there is an open source community called Front Legends inside, and it's not so much open source as it is more of an analytical community. So the analysts from this community state that certain signs of preparations by Russian troops and the Dnipro military group indicate that Russia is preparing to expand active offensive operations in the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions. Although the timing of these offensive operations remains uncertain, it is difficult to predict. But it is even more difficult for the Russian occupiers, especially considering how our deep strikes have recently been actively impacting their logistics in Rostov and Volgograd, these two branches of the railway connection. The Rostov and Volgograd regions, as is well known, play an important role in supporting the logistics of the south. Therefore, it is difficult to predict exactly when the Russians might launch these offensive actions. But their goal here is undoubtedly clear: to stretch Ukrainian forces by expanding the active front line so that our relatively few units suffer. In particular, among such suffering, they undoubtedly also aim to intensify activity, potentially in the Kherson direction. It is no coincidence that the southern districts of Kherson, especially the Ostriv district, are being blocked. This is the quarantine island of the city of Kherson, where the Russians spent an entire week carrying out a demonstrative operation attempting to destroy the bridge in this area. And another conclusion that this analytical community shares, I'll leave it for last as a sort of cherry on top, the highlight. Recently, the Russians have become genuinely concerned that Ukrainian forces might launch certain offensives. They are speculating about various scenarios. I think this could range from a Kursk-like scenario somewhere in the Bryansk region to even an offensive in the south. The Russians are worried about different scenarios, as they write in their Z Telegram channels. At the moment, there is no reliable confirmation of these scenarios except, let's say, for one speculation. This speculation is based on an interview with Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi, who recently gave an interview to TSN Tizden. TSN, well, generally on 1+1 channel. Syrskyi said that essentially we must inflict such losses on the enemy that they are forced to end the war. That is, speaking in the context of diplomacy, in the context of ending the war, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine says that we need to inflict such losses on the enemy that they themselves will want to end the war, and not from a position of strength, but on our Ukrainian terms. So this is a kind of power diplomacy. Well, if the commander-in-chief has such thoughts, I hope he also has the tools to implement them. I always hope. And on that note, I'll end here. Thank you, friends. Take care. All the best, and until we meet again.